Hello and welcome to today's video. We are going to be discussing how to open a game of chess. And we call this beginning phase of a chess game the opening. And there are some ideas that we can keep in mind that will really help us when deciding what and where to move. And we call these ideas opening principles. And the first opening principle we're going to talk about is controlling the center of the chessboard. And more specifically, the four center squares. We have e4, e5, d4, and d5. And these four center squares are directly in the middle, and if we can put our pieces or occupy these squares or control these squares by attacking them, then we're going to be well on our way to creating a good opening position. So keeping this in mind, a very popular move to start off a game of chess is the pawn in front of the king moving forward two squares. And this pawn occupies one of the center squares by being on that square, and it also controls a center square because we know pawns capture diagonally, and this pawn is aimed diagonally at d5, and it is controlling that square. So kind of doing two things with that move, and it's a really good move. Another move to control the center of the board that's popular is moving the pawn in front of the queen too. And it does something very similar. It occupies the center square as well as controls the center square by attacking the e5 square. If we pretend that a player had several moves in a row to try to control the center of the chessboard, one idea might be to put two pawns right in the middle of the chessboard and occupy those two squares as well as control two squares in the center. And if we continue that, White could develop their knights from the back row, and development is our second opening principle. This refers to getting our knights and our bishops off the back row and getting them to squares that help control the center of the chessboard. So White's knights, even though they are not on one of the center squares, this knight is aimed at e4 as well as d5 and is helping to control some of those center squares. And the knight f3 is aimed at d4, and e5. So those knights are developed, and development includes the bishops. Let's say White could develop both of their bishops to these squares, and again, even though they are not directly on one of the center squares, they are aimed or controlling some center squares, and these pieces are more powerful here than they were on the back row. Let's take a look at a quick example. If you watched our video on how the pieces move, you'll recall that a knight in the center of the board can jump to a total of 8 squares, and I have placed 8 black pawns on every square that this knight can move to. So pieces, in particular knights and bishops, can move to more squares if they're in the center of the chessboard, and let's take a look at if we were to move this knight to the edge of the board. A knight on the edge of the board only has half or 4 squares that it can move to on its next turn, which makes that knight half as powerful because it doesn't have as many squares to move to. And the extreme is if we put a knight in the corner of the board, that knight only has 2 squares to move to. So this is why getting our knights and our bishops off of the back row and developing them and trying to get them closer to the center of the board and control the center is a really good thing in the opening of a chess game. Let's go back to our other position. So far, White has occupied the center squares with their pawns and developed their knights and their bishops to help control the center of the board. And next up is our third opening principle, and that is making sure the king is safe. The king is the most valuable piece in chess, and we don't want the king in the center of the chessboard where all the capturing and action will be taking place. So one common way of making the king safe is to make the move castle. And a quick review, when a king castles, that king moves over 2 squares and the rook jumps on the opposite side. And a king may not castle if that king is moved or the rook on the side that you're castling has moved. nor can the king move into check or pass through check. And now that the king is safely castled and the knights and the bishops are developed, if white had more moves, maybe they would develop their queen and link their rooks together and possibly move their rooks to the center of the chessboard. And this is kind of a dream position or an ideal situation if your opponent would let you occupy and control all these squares. That could be a really good start to your game of chess. So I hope you found this video on how to open a game of chess helpful, and thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.